In exactly 5 minutes, Whitney Houston was supposed to walk onto the biggest stage in music and deliver a performance that millions would watch live around the world. Instead, she was locked in a bathroom backstage, hyperventilating so badly that her vision was tunneling into darkness. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might explode. And the voice that had made her the most successful female artist of all time was completely frozen in her throat. This wasn't nerves. This was a full-blown panic attack, and it was destroying her right when she needed to be at her absolute best. The Grammy Awards had always been Whitney's night to shine, but 1999 was different. The media had spent the past year tearing her apart. Tabloids were running stories about her marriage troubles, her weight, her supposed declining vocal abilities. Critics were writing think pieces about whether Whitney Houston was still relevant in an era of rising pop stars and changing musical tastes. Every morning brought new headlines questioning whether the Queen was losing her crown. And tonight, performing in front of the entire music industry and a global television audience of over 30 million people, Whitney was supposed to prove them all wrong. But she couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She couldn't remember why she had ever agreed to perform at this ceremony in the first place. Her publicist was knocking frantically on the bathroom door, reminding her that she had 4 minutes until she was supposed to be in position. The stage manager was calling her name over the backstage intercom, and Whitney was staring at her reflection in the mirror, watching mascara run down her face as tears poured from eyes that had forgotten how to see anything except her own failure. Then she heard a voice that wasn't coming through the door or over the intercom. It was coming from right beside her, soft and familiar and completely unexpected. "Whitney, you don't have to be perfect tonight. You just have to be present." She turned and saw Luther Vandross sitting on the floor next to the bathroom counter, his back against the wall, looking up at her with the kind of gentle understanding that only comes from someone who has been exactly where you are. Whitney had no idea how he had gotten into the locked bathroom or how long he had been sitting there watching her fall apart. But suddenly, none of that mattered because Luther began doing something that changed everything. He started singing The Greatest Love of All, the song that had become Whitney's signature anthem, but he sang it differently than she had ever heard it before. He sang it quietly, almost in a whisper, like a lullaby meant to calm a frightened child. And as he sang, something inside Whitney that had been wound impossibly tight began very slowly to unwind. To understand why Whitney Houston was having a panic attack in a bathroom at the 1999 Grammy Awards, you have to go back further than the past year of bad press and public scrutiny. You have to go back to 1985, when a 21-year-old girl with an impossible voice stepped into a recording studio and changed popular music forever. Whitney's self-titled debut album had been a phenomenon beyond anyone's expectations. It spent 14 weeks at #1 on the Billboard charts and produced 3 consecutive #1 singles, something that had never been done before by a debut artist. She won her first Grammy at age 23. By age 25, she had become the biggest female artist in the world, and that was when the pressure really began. From the very beginning, Whitney had been different from other pop stars. She came from a gospel background with a mother, Cissy Houston, who was a respected session singer, and a cousin, Dionne Warwick, who was already a legend. Music wasn't just something Whitney did. It was woven into every part of who she was. But that also meant that every time she performed, she wasn't just representing herself. She was representing her family's musical legacy, the Black church tradition that had shaped her voice, and the expectations of millions of fans who saw her as something close to perfect. The burden of that perfection had been manageable in the early years when everything was going right. But by the mid-90s, cracks were starting to show. Whitney's marriage to singer Bobby Brown, which had begun as a genuine love story, was becoming increasingly turbulent as both of them struggled with the pressures of fame and the demons that come with it. The media, which had once celebrated Whitney as America's sweetheart, turned on her with the kind of viciousness that only comes when people feel betrayed by someone they had put on a pedestal. Stories about Whitney's personal life began to overshadow her music. Paparazzi followed her everywhere looking for evidence that she was falling apart. Critics who had once praised her voice began writing reviews suggesting that she had lost her edge, that she was playing it safe, that the spark that made her special was dimming. And the more Whitney tried to prove them wrong, the more anxious and self-conscious she became. By 1999, Whitney was trapped in a vicious cycle. The pressure to be perfect made her more anxious. The anxiety affected her performances. The imperfect performances brought more criticism, and the criticism increased the pressure to be perfect. It was a spiral that was slowly destroying one of the greatest talents in music history. The Grammy performance was supposed to be her comeback moment. She had chosen to sing I Believe in You and Me, a powerful ballad from The Preacher's Wife soundtrack that showcased everything Whitney's voice could do when it was at its best. Her team had planned every detail meticulously. The staging would be simple and elegant, putting all the focus on her voice. The lighting would be soft and flattering. Everything was designed to remind the world why Whitney Houston was special. But standing in that bathroom 5 minutes before she was supposed to go on, Whitney couldn't remember what made her special at all. All she could feel was the weight of 30 million people waiting to judge whether she still had it, whether she was still worthy of the crown she had worn for so long. The panic attack had come out of nowhere, or at least that's how it felt to Whitney. She had been fine during rehearsals earlier that day. She had been calm during hair and makeup. But then she had made the mistake of looking at her phone and seeing a news alert about how critics were calling this performance make or break for her career. That's when her heart had started racing. That's when the bathroom walls had started closing in. And that's when Luther Vandross, her friend and fellow artist who understood pressure better than almost anyone, had somehow found her and sat down on that bathroom floor to sing her back from the edge. Luther Vandross knew something about panic and pressure that very few people in the music industry understood. He had built his career on being the smooth, sophisticated singer of romantic ballads, the master of love songs who made everything look effortless. But behind that polished exterior was someone who had fought his entire life with anxiety, perfectionism, and the crushing weight of expectations. Luther had started as a background singer, working with everyone from David Bowie to Barbra Streisand before launching his solo career in 1981. He was a perfectionist who would spend hours in the studio getting a single vocal line exactly right, who would redo entire songs if one note felt slightly off. That perfectionism had made him one of the most respected vocalists in the industry, but it had also made him one of the most anxious. What most people didn't know about Luther was that he had his own history with panic attacks. In 1986, during what should have been a triumphant sold-out concert at Madison Square Garden, Luther had frozen on stage mid-song, unable to continue because the pressure of delivering perfection had become too much. His band had covered for him, extending an instrumental section while he recovered backstage. But Luther never forgot the terror of that moment when his body had simply stopped cooperating with what his mind wanted it to do. After that night, Luther had worked with therapists and vocal coaches to develop strategies for managing his anxiety. He learned breathing techniques and meditation. He learned how to separate his sense of self-worth from the quality of any single performance. Most importantly, he learned that the moments when he felt most vulnerable were often the moments when his performances became most powerful, because vulnerability is what allows artists to truly connect with their audiences. When Luther saw Whitney's name on the Grammy performance schedule for 1999, he knew immediately that this was going to be a difficult night for her. He had been watching from a distance as the media circus around Whitney had intensified over the past year, and he recognized the warning signs of someone who was being crushed by the weight of other people's expectations. Luther had tried to call Whitney several times in the weeks leading up to the Grammys, but she hadn't returned his calls. He understood why. When you're drowning, the last thing you want to do is admit it to someone who might judge you for not being able to swim. So Luther made a decision. He would go to the Grammys even though he wasn't performing that year, and he would position himself somewhere close to Whitney in case she needed help. He didn't know if she would need him. He just knew that if she did, he wanted to be there. That's why when Whitney's publicist started frantically looking for her 20 minutes before her performance slot, Luther was the one who found her. He had been keeping an eye on the backstage area and noticed when Whitney slipped away from her dressing room and disappeared. He followed at a distance and saw her lock herself in the bathroom near the back hallway, away from the main backstage crowd. For several minutes, Luther stood outside that bathroom door listening to Whitney cry and trying to decide what to do. He could get her publicist or her mother or one of her assistants. He could alert the Grammy producers that they might need to delay the schedule. Or he could do what his instincts were telling him to do, which was to stop trying to fix the situation and simply be present with someone who was suffering. The bathroom door had one of those industrial locks that could be opened from the outside with a coin or a key. Luther found a quarter in his pocket, turned the lock mechanism, and quietly entered the bathroom. Whitney was so lost in her panic that she didn't even notice him at first. He sat down on the floor, leaned against the wall, and waited until she was ready to see him. When she finally turned and their eyes met, Luther saw the same terror he had felt that night at Madison Square Garden 13 years earlier. And that's when he knew exactly what Whitney needed to hear. She didn't need someone to tell her she was great, or that the critics were wrong, or that everything would be fine. She needed someone to give her permission to be imperfect, to be scared, to be human. So he told her she didn't have to be perfect, and then he started singing. The song Luther chose to sing in that bathroom wasn't random. The Greatest Love of All had been written in 1977 for a Muhammad Ali biopic, but it had become synonymous with Whitney Houston after her version topped the charts in 1986. For 13 years, Whitney had performed that song hundreds of times, and it had become both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it was the song that defined her as an artist, the anthem that captured everything her voice could do. On the other hand, it was the song that audiences always expected her to perform perfectly, the song that had become a measuring stick for whether she was still at the top of her game. Luther understood all of this, which is why he didn't sing The Greatest Love of All the way Whitney usually performed it, with those soaring high notes and powerful crescendos. Instead, he sang it the way someone might sing a hymn in church when they're trying to remember why they believe, soft and searching and vulnerable. He sang about learning to love yourself and finding strength from within, and as he sang, he looked directly at Whitney with eyes that seemed to be saying these aren't just lyrics. These are the words you need to hear right now. Whitney, still sitting on the bathroom floor with her back against the wall, found herself listening to her own signature song as if she was hearing it for the first time. When Luther sang the line about finding the greatest love inside yourself, Whitney felt something shift in her chest. She had been so focused on what the critics thought, what the audience expected, what the media was saying, that she had completely forgotten to look for validation from the one person whose opinion actually mattered: herself. Luther sang through the entire first verse and chorus before he stopped and spoke again. You know what I realized after Madison Square Garden? The performances I remember most aren't the ones where everything went perfectly. They're the ones where I was scared and did it anyway. That's what people connect with, not perfection. Courage. Whitney wiped her eyes and took her first deep breath in what felt like hours. How did you know I was here? Luther smiled. Because I've been you. I've been locked in bathrooms and dressing rooms and hotel rooms thinking I couldn't do it. And every time, what got me through wasn't reminding myself that I'm good at singing. It was reminding myself that I'm human first and a singer second. Whitney looked at herself in the mirror again, but this time she wasn't seeing failure staring back at her. She was seeing someone who was terrified but still trying, someone who was imperfect but still showing up, someone who was vulnerable but still willing to put herself out there. That's when she heard herself speak for the first time since the panic attack started. I don't know if I can do this. Luther stood up and offered his hand to help Whitney off the floor. Of course you can't. None of us can. That's the secret. We're all just faking it until we feel it. But you know what? Even your worst performance on your worst day is still going to move somebody in that audience. Because that's what your gift does. It reaches people. Not because you're perfect, because you're willing to share it. Whitney took Luther's hand and let him pull her to her feet. She looked at the bathroom mirror one more time and saw that her makeup was ruined and her hair was slightly disheveled, and there was no way she was going to look camera-ready in the 3 minutes she had left before her performance slot. But somehow that didn't seem to matter as much anymore. Luther handed her a paper towel and watched as she dabbed at her face. The stage manager's voice came over the intercom again, more urgent this time. Whitney Houston, this is your 2-minute call. Whitney Houston, 2 minutes. Whitney looked at Luther with something that might have been panic trying to creep back in, but Luther shook his head. Remember what I said. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be present. Then he said something that Whitney would carry with her for the rest of her life. The greatest performance isn't the one where you hit every note perfectly. It's the one where you show up even though you're afraid. That's what courage sounds like. The walk from that bathroom to the stage wings felt both impossibly long and over too quickly. Luther walked beside Whitney the entire way, not saying anything more, just being a steady presence as she put one foot in front of the other. Her publicist met them halfway with emergency makeup supplies and managed to do quick repair work on Whitney's face while they walked. Her vocal coach appeared with water and reminded her of breathing techniques. Her mother, Sissy, somehow materialized out of nowhere and squeezed her hand, without asking any questions about why she was late or why her eyes were red. The backstage area was controlled chaos. Other performers were warming up in corners. Producers were speaking urgently into headsets. Camera operators were making last-minute adjustments to their equipment. And in the middle of all of it, Whitney Houston was trying to remember how to breathe normally while walking toward the moment that felt like it would define whether her career survived or died. When they reached the stage wings, Whitney could hear the presenter introducing her, could hear the applause building, could see the lights and the audience and the cameras that would broadcast her performance to millions of people around the world. The panic tried to come back. Her chest tightened. Her hands started shaking again. But then she felt Luther's hand on her shoulder and heard him whisper one last thing. "You're not performing for the critics or the cameras or even the audience. You're performing for that little girl who fell in love with music before anyone told her she was supposed to be perfect. Sing for her." The presenter called her name. The applause swelled. The lights hit their mark. And Whitney Houston walked onto that Grammy stage not because she felt ready or confident or perfect, but because Luther Vandross had reminded her that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's feeling the fear and doing it anyway. What happened next would be talked about for years as one of the most powerful vocal performances in Grammy history, not despite Whitney's vulnerability, but because of it. When Whitney stepped into the spotlight and the opening notes of "I Believe in You and Me" began to play, something was different about her presence. The usual polish and perfection that characterized her performances had been stripped away, replaced by something rawer and more real. Her eyes were slightly red from crying. Her posture was less rigid than usual. And when she opened her mouth to sing, her voice carried not just technical skill, but emotional honesty that came from a place of genuine vulnerability. The first verse was softer than she usually sang it, almost tentative, as if she was testing whether her voice would still work after everything that had happened backstage. But then something extraordinary occurred. As Whitney sang about believing in someone, about trusting even when it's hard, about finding faith when everything feels uncertain, she realized she wasn't just singing words anymore. She was living them in real time in front of millions of people. The fear that had paralyzed her in that bathroom was still there, but now she was singing through it rather than trying to hide it. And the audience could feel it. Luther watched from the wings as Whitney's performance unfolded, and he saw the exact moment when she stopped performing and started communicating. It was during the bridge when the song builds to its emotional peak. Most singers would have used that moment to showcase their vocal range, to hit those big notes that make audiences applaud. But Whitney did something different. She pulled back instead of pushing forward. She sang the most emotionally vulnerable line almost in a whisper, letting the pain and uncertainty in her voice be audible rather than covering it with technical perfection. The Shrine Auditorium went completely silent. 30 million people watching at home stopped whatever they were doing, because everyone recognized that they were witnessing something rare. They were seeing a superstar being human, an icon being vulnerable, a perfect voice acknowledging its imperfections. And it was more powerful than any perfectly executed performance could ever be. When Whitney reached the final chorus, her voice opened up into the full power that everyone knew she possessed. But it was different this time. It wasn't just showing off what her instrument could do. It was expressing everything she had been feeling, all the fear and doubt and determination to keep going despite it all. Every note carried the weight of her struggle and the triumph of still being there despite wanting to run away. When Whitney finished the final note of her performance, there was a brief moment of absolute silence in the Shrine Auditorium. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it felt eternal. Then the entire venue erupted in applause that was unlike anything the Grammy Awards had heard before. This wasn't just appreciation for technical skill. This was recognition of courage. Everyone in that auditorium, from the biggest stars in music to the camera operators and technical crew, was standing and applauding not just for Whitney's voice, but for her willingness to be vulnerable in the most public way possible. The standing ovation lasted 7 minutes. The Grammy producers tried multiple times to cut to commercial or move on to the next segment, but the applause wouldn't stop. People weren't just clapping. They were crying. They were hugging each other. They were having the same realization that Luther had hoped they would have, which was that perfection isn't what moves us. Humanity is what moves us. Backstage, Whitney walked off the stage and directly into Luther's arms. She was shaking again, but this time it wasn't from panic. It was from the adrenaline of having faced her biggest fear and survived. Luther held her while she cried, and he whispered something that only she could hear. "You just taught millions of people what real strength looks like." Whitney pulled back and looked at him through her tears. "I was so scared. I still am." Luther smiled. "Good. That means you're alive. Scared means you care. Scared means it matters. Don't ever lose that." The days following that Grammy performance brought a flood of responses that nobody had expected. Critics who had been writing negative reviews of Whitney for months suddenly published pieces about how her vulnerability had reminded them why they fell in love with music in the first place. Fellow artists who had watched the performance sent messages saying that Whitney had inspired them to be more honest in their own work. And most importantly, fans around the world reached out to say that seeing Whitney struggle and triumph had given them courage to face their own fears. One letter that Whitney received came from a teenage girl who had been planning to quit singing because she didn't think she was good enough. But after watching Whitney's Grammy performance, the girl realized that being good enough wasn't about perfection. It was about having the courage to share your voice even when you're afraid it won't be received well. That letter, along with hundreds of others like it, helped Whitney understand what Luther had been trying to tell her. Her influence wasn't just about hitting high notes or having a powerful voice. It was about showing people that even the most talented and successful individuals still struggle, still doubt themselves, still need courage to get through difficult moments. Within weeks, the narrative around Whitney Houston in the media began to shift. Instead of focusing on whether she was still at her peak, journalists started writing about her longevity and resilience. Instead of comparing her current performances to her past work, critics started appreciating each performance for what it offered in that moment. The change wasn't complete or universal, but it was noticeable. And for Whitney, the experience of that Grammy night changed how she approached every performance afterward. She stopped trying to be perfect and started trying to be present. She stopped worrying about what critics thought and started focusing on connecting with audiences. She stopped seeing vulnerability as weakness and started recognizing it as her greatest strength. The friendship between Whitney Houston and Luther Vandross deepened significantly after that Grammy night. They had always been friendly colleagues in the industry, but now they became something more like battle-tested companions who had seen each other at their most vulnerable. They began calling each other regularly, especially before big performances or difficult days. Whitney would phone Luther when she was feeling anxious about a show, and he would remind her about the bathroom at the Grammys and about performing for the little girl who loved music before anyone told her she needed to be perfect. Luther would call Whitney when he was struggling with his own perfectionism, and she would remind him that the audience didn't need perfection, they needed connection. In 2003, Luther suffered a severe stroke that affected his ability to speak and sing, robbing him of the very gifts that had defined his life. During his long recovery, Whitney visited him regularly at his rehabilitation facility. She would sit beside his bed and sing to him the same way he had sung to her in that Grammy bathroom, quietly and without any pressure to be perfect, just offering music as a form of comfort and connection. Luther's recovery was slow and difficult, and he never fully regained his performing abilities. But Whitney later said that watching Luther face his limitations with grace and dignity taught her even more about courage than that night at the Grammys. He showed her that true strength isn't about always being at your best. It's about finding value in yourself even when you can't do the things that used to define you. When Luther passed away in 2005, Whitney sang at his memorial service. She chose to perform The Greatest Love of All, the same song he had sung to her in that bathroom 6 years earlier. But she sang it the way he had taught her to sing it, with vulnerability and honesty rather than trying to prove anything to anyone. There wasn't a dry eye in the church, not because Whitney's voice was technically perfect that day, which it wasn't, but because everyone there could feel the genuine love and gratitude she had for the man who had taught her that being human was more important than being perfect. The lesson that Luther taught Whitney that night at the Grammys rippled out far beyond their personal friendship. Other artists who heard the story began approaching their own performances differently, focusing more on emotional honesty and less on technical perfection. Vocal coaches started teaching their students about the importance of vulnerability alongside technique. And countless fans who had struggled with their own perfectionism and anxiety found inspiration in Whitney's willingness to show up and perform even when she was terrified. In interviews later in her career, Whitney often referenced that Grammy night as a turning point. She would talk about how Luther had given her permission to be imperfect, and how that permission had actually made her a better artist. She said that before that night, she had been so focused on protecting her reputation and proving she was still the best that she had forgotten why she started singing in the first place. Luther reminded me that music isn't about being better than everyone else, Whitney said in a 2006 interview. It's about sharing something true with people who need to hear it, and the truth is never perfect. It's messy and complicated and vulnerable, but that's what makes it beautiful. The story of what happened in that bathroom and on that stage became part of music industry folklore, a reminder that sometimes the most important thing one artist can do for another is simply be present during their moment of crisis. Luther didn't fix Whitney's problems that night. He didn't make her panic attack go away or eliminate the media pressure she was facing. What he did was remind her that she was more than her performances, that her worth wasn't determined by other people's opinions, and that courage looks like showing up even when you're afraid. That reminder, delivered through a whispered song and some gentle words, gave Whitney the strength to walk onto that stage and deliver a performance that moved millions of people not because it was perfect, but because it was real. And in doing so, Luther gave all of us a model for how to support each other through our most vulnerable moments, not by trying to fix everything or minimize the struggle, but by sitting beside each other in the difficulty and reminding each other that we're human first and whatever else second. Today, when people watch footage of Whitney Houston's 1999 Grammy performance, those who know the full story see more than just a beautiful vocal performance. They see a woman who was minutes away from not performing at all, who walked onto that stage carrying fear and doubt and vulnerability, and who transformed all of that into something that moved millions. They see Luther Vandross's gift being lived out in real time. The lesson of that night continues to resonate in the music industry and beyond. It reminds us that our struggles don't disqualify us from doing meaningful work. They actually make our work more meaningful because they make us more relatable and more human. It teaches us that the people around us may be fighting battles we know nothing about, and that sometimes the most important thing we can do is be present rather than trying to have all the answers. And it shows us that vulnerability, which our culture often treats as weakness, is actually one of our greatest sources of strength, because it's what allows us to truly connect with each other. Whitney Houston's voice was a gift to the world, but perhaps Luther Vandross's gift to Whitney that night was even more valuable. He gave her permission to bring her whole self to her art, fear and imperfection included. And in doing so, he helped create a performance that did more than just showcase technical ability. It showcased the human spirit's capacity to face fear and show up anyway, to be vulnerable in front of millions, and find strength in that vulnerability, to remember that we're all just doing our best with what we have in each moment. The greatest performance isn't the one where you hit every note perfectly. It's the one where you show up even though you're afraid. That's what courage sounds like. Those words, spoken in a bathroom 5 minutes before one of the most important performances of Whitney Houston's career, became more than just encouragement for one difficult night. They became a philosophy for approaching life itself. We all face moments when we feel inadequate, when the pressure feels too great, when we want to hide rather than show ourselves to the world. And in those moments, we all need someone like Luther who will sit beside us and remind us that we don't have to be perfect, we just have to be present. We don't have to have it all figured out, we just have to keep showing up. We don't have to hide our fear, we just have to find the courage to move forward despite it. That's the legacy of what happened at the 1999 Grammy Awards. Not just a great performance, but a powerful reminder that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply be honest about our struggles while still trying our best. And sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone else is permission to be imperfect, vulnerable, and beautifully human.